if you'd rather take the plunge.
Congress is about to close up shop for the 4th of July holidays, and so I thought it'd be a good idea to bring you up to date on a wide array of current topics and respond to your questions. During the next 2 weeks, the U.S. will join its allies in considering a number of crucial political, security, and international economic issues. And seldom in the last 40 years have such questions had such direct impact on the lives of all Americans. Today in the U.S., we are carefully examining the historic changes in Eastern Europe, size of our military forces, our ability to compete in world markets, the assistance that we provide to help emerging democracies, and the size and priorities of our own budget, and how to continue the 90 months of economic expansion that we've enjoyed. These issues are not abstract. Every American has a stake in how we as a nation address these very complex questions. On July 5th and 6th in London, the NATO alliance will gather to forge a new direction for the future, and at the Houston Economic Summit, we will press for progress in the Uruguay round of trade negotiations, discuss economic support for various countries, and review progress on the environment. These international concerns are reflected in many of the decisions I made just this week. First, we're doing what is necessary to assure continuation of the economic expansion, now in its 90th month, and we want to keep it going. We now estimate a deficit of over $150 billion in fiscal 1991, not counting the costs of the savings and loan cleanup. And this means that unless Congress acts, there will be a cutoff in October of nearly $100 billion in government services under the sequester provisions of the Graham-Rudman-Hollings. The potential results, draconian cuts in defense, student grants, and a wide array of other necessary domestic services. And to avoid this, tough decisions must be made. And leadership is needed, and that is exactly what administration officials are seeking to provide, and indeed in these talks, I believe, are providing. The budget negotiations now underway are a make-or-break effort at responsible government. The congressional budgeting process must succeed, and the negotiators are facing tough questions about where to make cuts and where to raise the revenues. And these are not decisions that anyone relishes. They are decisions that Democrats and Republicans alike have got to face with candor and courage. And frankly, I believe that ultimately good politics is rooted in good government. And I'm optimistic that we can get a budget agreement legislated, which not only tells the world that America puts its fiscal house in order, but also will garner the full support of the American people. Secondly, this week we reached an agreement with the Japanese on structural impediments initiative that's going to help to open markets and create new opportunities for business and commerce. Next, we took an important step toward increasing jobs, opportunity, and economic prosperity throughout our own hemisphere. Enterprise for the Americas, an innovative and I think visionary plan for increased trade and investment with Latin America and the Caribbean, and the response from south of our border has been overwhelmingly positive. And this included a new proposal on official debt in the hemisphere, which will help our neighbors in Latin America and the Caribbean resume the process of growth. We developed a plan for protecting our coastal resources, this OCS decision, while also endeavoring to protect energy independence. And as I leave for the 4th of July holiday, then from there to the NATO summit, and then to the Houston Economic Summit, I just wanted to assure you that America will squarely face the challenges of leadership that are before us, both domestically and in terms of international affairs. Terry?
Mr. President, I'd like to ask you about your reversal on no new taxes. Do you consider that a betrayal of your promise? And what do you say to Republicans who complain that you've robbed them of the same campaign issue that helped get you elected?
Well, I think what I consider it is a necessary step to get stalled budget negotiations moving. And I am very encouraged with the approach taken now by Republicans and Democrats in these important discussions that are going on. I'm not going to discuss details, what I'll accept and what I won't accept, but things are moving, and I think that much more important today is getting this deficit down, continuing economic expansion and employment in this country. So that's the way I'd respond to it.
Well, what do you say to, can people trust politicians if they make statements and are willing to break them?
Well, you know, I recall a previous flurry when I was vice president, and there was some economic plans proposed back in '82 that caused a furor, something like we're hearing now. And the president, in my view, did what was right. And so I think that we're on the right track. And I think that the arrows have been flying, front, back, sideways. But that's what I get paid for. And I think we're on the right track now. And I think we'll have strong support from both sides of the aisle.
Mr. President, but do you believe it will hurt your credibility?
No, not in the long run.
Why not? A lot of people are already...
Because what people are interested in are jobs, economic growth. People know this deficit is bad. People know that we're going to have to take some action, and that's why I think not.
But what will you say to American people who said you made a promise no new taxes?
I'll say I take a look at a new situation. I see an enormous deficit. I see a savings and loan problem out there that has to be resolved. And like Abraham Lincoln said, I'll think anew. I'm not violating or getting away from my fundamental conviction on taxes, anything of that nature. Not in the least. But what I've said is on the table, and let's see where we go. But we got a very important national problem. And I think the president owes the people his judgment at the moment he has to address that problem. And that's exactly what I'm trying to do. And look, I knew I'd catch some flack on this decision, just those two words. But I've got to do what I think is right, and then I'll ask the people for support. But more important than posturing now or even negotiating is the result. Do we continue to provide jobs for the American people? And do we continue to provide economic growth? And do we try to stop saddling the generations on the way up, and the young people, with absolutely unacceptable deficits? Yeah.
What will you do with the savings and loan situation? Is there any way to do a budget with that still coming out of general revenue? Do you have to push the whole issue off to the side?
Well, we can't push it off to the side. We've got to solve the problem. My interest on that one, incidentally, is to protect the depositor. Put the people that broke the law in jail, and that is exactly what the policy that we proposed did. We came in here in 18 days after taking office, initiated a very important savings and loan policy. And the size of the savings and loan problem is terrible, and we are trying very hard to go after the criminals and to have in place rules and regulations so that this will never happen again, and to protect the depositors. Those are the three key elements of what I'm trying to do.
But where do you pay for it? Is it out of the taxes that the government takes in every year from the American taxpayer?
Well, we have to. People are going to have to pay for it, and it goes as a part of all our expenditures I'm talking about. There has got to be a remedy, yes.
Mr. President, on another subject, Prime Minister Shamir has
Good,
sent
Michael. I was hoping we'd get to another one.
Well, we can go back and attack it later, but Prime Minister Shamir has sent you what appears to be a pretty tough letter ruling out flatly talks with any Palestinian with any sort of authority. Do you feel the peace process is deadlocked, and are you concerned that the hardliners, the voices of extremism now have the upper hand throughout the region?
I am concerned about a deadlock in the peace process. We have received the Shamir letter, came over to me late last night. The analysis process between NSC and state has just started, so I can't give you or provide the American people with a response to that letter. But yes, I am very concerned about a high centering of the peace process. And we've had a plan, And it is a sound plan, and I want to see it go forward. So we'll be analyzing the Shamir response very, very carefully, and hopefully then go back and say, find some material in the response that permit us to get these talks going again. It is essential. The status quo is unacceptable to everybody. But I can't give you right now whether I think the letter is negative or positive or something of that nature.
Can you see any way to get this peace process going unless the Israelis show some willingness to talk to Palestinians with some authority?
I think there has got to be discussion with Palestinians, and that has to happen. And we will push and find ways to make it happen if we can. We're halfway across the world, but we are going to we are not going to give up on that kind of solution to this problem. We have to do that. But if we get totally stiff-armed on the Baker approach, or what was the Shamir plan, Mubarak's help on it, he could have his name on it, then we go back to the drawing board, because we're not going to sit here and do nothing. Yeah, Leslie.
Mr. President, I'm sorry, but I'd like to go back to taxes.
Oh, Leslie, I thought you'd want to get...
I know it's hard for you. I can tell it is, and it's difficult.
It's not hard.
Okay, if it's not hard, could you clarify what seems to be a fuzzing up of the issues by some Republicans who are trying to say that your new statement isn't new? Are you telling the American people that this budget outcome is going to be higher taxes?
I'm telling the people that there's negotiations going on right now, and there are no preconditions, and everything's on the table. And we will see where we come out, and when we get an agreement that is supported by Democrats and Republicans alike, I will then, and if I think it's a good agreement, I will then tell the American people clearly why they need to support it. What's at stake for them in terms of jobs, a continued growth in this economy.
But you're saying, right here, you're not saying it. You're not saying we have to raise taxes. Why aren't you saying...
I'll tell you, sorry I missed your point. We agreed with the Democratic leaders that we would not discuss the details of what's going on in these discussions, and we're not going to do that. So if and when we come up with a program that raises revenues, and our original budget talked about that, and if there are taxes in it, why, then I will go out there and advocate strong bipartisan support for this. But if I get into going into each kind of tax that's discussed, or each kind of political budget reform, or each kind of spending cut, I will be doing something that I have asked our negotiators and the Congress not to do.
Yeah, but what you say in your statement, tax revenues are required.
Yeah.
Is that the same as taxes?
And I say budget reforms are required, and I say spending cuts are required. And so let's see where we come out on that.
Is it taxes?
Is what taxes?
What you're saying. Are you saying taxes are higher taxes are...
Leslie, I've told you what I've said, and I can't help you anymore. Nice try. You got it. You got it. You've seen the arrows coming my way, and that's fine. But let people interpret it anyway. Well, I want to leave it the way I said I would, so the negotiators are free to discuss a wide array of options, including tax increases. Does that help?
No.
Mr. President, you mentioned a couple of times that you're getting arrows from all directions. One newspaper headline declared, read my lips, I lied. Is this kind of criticism justified? Is it fair? Do you deserve it?
Well, I expected it. But I think the deserving of it the proof of the pudding is going to be in the eating and how it comes out. Because I think the American people recognize that the budget is greater than we had predicted and than Democrats had predicted. The economy has been slower, and so we'll just wait and see how we come out. But no, I can't say I didn't expect to hear some campaign words played back to me, and it's been fairly intense. But I'll tell you, I've been more relaxed about it than I thought I'd be. I went back into history and took a look at what others have had to go through in this job. So it hasn't been as tense. You know, we had some congressional candidates over there yesterday, people running, and they don't want to see tax increases. And some of them, I could see them, how are we going to handle this? We don't want to be rude to the president, but we feel strongly. And so one or two of them, a couple of them spoke up, and I could totally empathize with what they were going through. And but we didn't have time because it was about a 45-second handshake. But if we had, I just said, no, look, you got to look at the big picture here. Stay with your position. Advocate what you believe and what you tell your constituents, what you'll try to do. And then just stay a little bit open-minded so when we get an agreement, and I hope we will, that is good for the country, that you can say, well, we can accept this. Because we're going to need support from Republicans and Democrats alike, say nothing of the American people. But I think the people will support it. I think they want to see jobs and economic growth, and that is what is at stake.
But within hours after you released the statement, some of your staff members, Chief of Staff John Sununu, for one, was up on the Hill trying to assure conservative Republicans that nothing's changed. At this point, whose lips
I think what he was
American
talking
people
about
believe?
is that everything is on the table. Nothing's changed. I saw a lot of interpretations of what he said, but I've not seen a statement or anything of that nature. And you got various interpretations from various political factions. You've seen the Democratic Study Group has put out a mandate of what has to happen to have it just exactly their way. We have people that feel very strongly on our side. And so this we expected. We expected members of Congress who have strong convictions on how to approach this problem to weigh in. We expected editorial comment. We expected, as I say, some of the slings and the arrows. But I just have a comforting feeling after 2 or 3 days now that if I do my job right, and that is to help facilitate the negotiations, and then we can get a bipartisan agreement, and then I can go to the American people and say, look, we've all had to give or take a little on this, but this agreement is going to be good for future generations. It's going to be good for the economy. It's going to be good for jobs. Then people will say, look, we support the president.
Can you walk us through your thinking just a little bit? And was there one particular moment when you realized you were going to have these campaign promises played back at you all day? And...
The minute I decided that we would go forward on a joint statement, which I felt was necessary to get the budget process moving. But I'd had a preview of coming attractions, because when we said no preconditions, it wasn't, maybe that wasn't the exact word, but no preconditions, arrows started flying. And I understand this. I've been in the political wars. But I'm also president, and I've got to try now to look at the big picture and the welfare of this country and put it ahead of my own strongly held preferences and everything else. And that's exactly what's happening. And the process has started to move forward as a result of that statement with a seriousness that I applaud.
Could you talk a little bit about what made you feel that you needed
Just
to...
a follow, third follow.
Yes,
That's unfair.
second only for me. But could you talk a little bit about what led you to believe that that statement was necessary? Was there some moment of epiphany? Was there any particular bit of data that...
You mean, did I suddenly get hit with the lightning? No, I suddenly was presented with the fact from Democrats and Republicans and our 3 able negotiators in whom I have tremendous confidence. We got to do something to get the process going forward. But I don't recall any, because I'm not changing my view on taxes. I'm just saying everything's on the table. We may have to do something here. And, but if I were going to go back and say, do it my way, we'd figure out a way that would be somewhat less controversial than this approach has been, yeah.
Mr. President, if it was so comforting and good for the country, why didn't you do it a year ago?
Because we've got a problem that is of far greater magnitude today, because we've had a much slower economy than anybody predicted. And that has meant revenue shortfalls. And that means bigger budget deficits. And that means more burden for future generations of Americans and unacceptably high interest rates. And so that is why
Are you saying the economy then is in some kind of trouble now that these problems...
I'm saying the economy is sluggish. And I think a deficit package that takes care, that is seen to be a real one, will have an ameliorating effect on that, and hopefully will result in lower interest rates and thus have a more vibrant, a more robust economy. Yeah.
You talked about the next NATO summit as a milestone. Next Friday, what are we going to see? Are we going to see a totally different NATO? How different would that be?
No, but we're going to see a NATO that makes very clear to the world one, that it's purely defensive, and two, that has a broadened agenda beside just military, building on Article 2 of the NATO document, the founding document. That's what you'll see, and I can't help you with the details because we obviously haven't even met yet.
Would there be any American proposal in there? NATO?
Well, I was asked the other day at a meeting with some foreign journalists whether there would be, I don't know they used the word bombshells, but big surprises. I don't anticipate that, but let's wait and see what happens when we get there. But the NATO goal at this juncture should be to convince President Gorbachev that a reconstituted NATO, with Germany as a full member, is not a threat to the Soviet Union, but rather provides stability for Europe, and thus will guarantee the continuance of the longest peace that Europe has had in its history. Frank, and then Maureen.
President, you're a great student of the American electorate. Have you concluded that the American public is more willing to consider and accept new taxes to deal with the deficit?
Not particularly. If you say to a guy, do you want to pay more taxes? I haven't found anybody that would say that. But I think if we do our job properly and they understand the magnitude of the problem at hand in terms of this deficit, and then we make a proposal that is fair on the revenue side, on the spending side, and then on the reform side so that we don't get in this mess again, and I'm going to restrain myself from putting the blame on Congress because it's hard to constrain spending, so we need some reform. Then I think if they see all three of these things and they see it's fair, that those people will support this.
Would you, under any circumstances, consider increasing income tax rates?
I've said and told the leaders that I'm not going to go into the details. They are not going into the details of what they will or won't accept. And the only way to accomplish a negotiation is to keep faith with that approach. And they are doing that, Republicans as well as Democrats. So I'm not going to go into the details.
Taxes are on the table, too.
I'm not saying what's on or off. I've made my statements on that, and I'm just going to go forward. I've got preferences, strongly held preferences that people are familiar with, but I'm not going to reiterate them because more important than my posturing or protecting from arrows coming from one direction is getting a deal that's fair and good for the American people. Yeah, Maureen. Then we'll go to the back. The middle, sorry.
Mr. President, I wonder if you can try to explain today why you made the no new taxes promise in the first place. At the time, the deficit was absolutely horrendous. The savings and loan situation was absolutely horrendous. And most people greeted your promise with a fair amount of cynicism, saying taxes were eventually going to be needed to bring down the deficit. Can you sort of blame people for now?
No, I don't want to blame anybody.
No, I'm just saying, can you blame people for looking back and saying, well, maybe he didn't really mean it the whole time?
I can understand people saying that. I think it's wrong, but I can understand it. I'm presented with new facts. I'm doing like Lincoln did, think anew. And I'm thinking anew. I've still got the principles that underline my political philosophy. I hadn't changed my view about whether, taxes, but we've got a major problem facing this country. And I have the responsibility, leading the executive branch, to get things moving, to get a solution. And the budget deficit is bigger, far bigger. I had thought I could do a better job on getting spending down and perhaps getting the reforms of the budget process that I also talked about. So we're not talking about, just in the campaign, talking about one aspect. I was talking about reform. I was talking about spending constraints and not having everything go exactly my way. Now we've got to address ourselves to a worse problem, Maureen, than any of us visualized back then. Yeah, Owen and then John.
Mr. President, throughout the 88 campaign, you kept saying, and this was a quote, the surest way to kill economic growth in this country is to raise taxes. Now you're telling us that the reason you're thinking anew about raising taxes is to make sure that you sustain economic growth, and yet you also told us that you're not changing your views about taxes. exactly what are your views about taxes?
Wait till you
and
see
what
the
are-
agreement that comes out. That will be my views, is what has to happen, hopefully, within a month of 1990. That'll be my views, faced with a problem very different than the problem facing the presidency in the end of 1988.
So do you believe that taxes kill economic growth, or do you believe
I
that
think
higher
taxes wrongly applied can kill economic growth. And yes, I do think that. So I think we've got to be very careful as to how we get this formula to see that we don't kill off economic growth. You got to look at the overall gross national product when you talk about that, too.
Why did you say that during the campaign, Mr. President?
Well, I don't think anybody did such a good penetrating job of questioning, and because the problem is different. The problem is quite different, Owen, today than it was then. Yeah, Tom. And then John. No, Tom, and then John. Patience is what it is. All right.
Thank you, Mr. President.
Yes, Tom.
Some members of Congress and some members of your own staff are saying that your three able negotiators, as you just described them, have signaled one important possible deal, and that is if the Democrats will give you your capital gains tax cut, you're prepared to go along with eliminating the bubble on the high end of the tax rate.
We're going to leave all the... No, it's not a fair, and I'm not sure your dope is correct either. But I just don't want to violate this concept of confidentiality while we're in the negotiating stage, and so I can't respond to it. But I wouldn't put too much trust in that one.
Mr. President, if your statement here this morning represents your latest thinking, why is it that a whole flock of conservative Republicans have already disavowed your position, considering a tacit request that taxes will be increased?
Well, for the same reason that same response occurred in 1982, John. And we have people who feel very strongly on this question, and I'm one of them. But I've got to make the case for the broader addressing ourselves of this problem here. But I can understand that.
It doesn't give you any pause that this fall you're going to be out campaigning for Republican candidates who disagree with you on taxes, as well as abortion and perhaps other issues?
No, we always had differences with me on all those issues, one way or another, one side or another. But we also have a matrix of a party that is opposed to tax and spend, who wants to constrain spending, and who wants reform. And I still feel a fundamental part of that, even though we're talking now about an agreement that will hopefully cover all three aspects of that. If it doesn't, there won't be an agreement, I guess. Yeah.
Secretary, President.
You got a message for me? This is going to work out. Don't worry about
Yesterday, Secretary of State Baker seemed to duck a question that encompassed two of your dilemmas. One is the specter of taxes, but the other is pressure from the Allies, which you'll see in NATO and then again at Houston, to help the Soviet Union, to give them some actually more than technical aid. Have you changed your thinking? Are you moving toward some sort of agreement with the Allies?
We have some differences in the alliance on this question. You're talking about on just strictly the aid to the Soviet Union. I've tried to be very frank and upfront, not only with the Allies, but with the Soviets on the difficulties we have at this juncture, because there has got to be economic reform there, market reform, and all kinds of changes that I believe Gorbachev wants to see take place. But they have to be in place for the United States to go forward. Then we have a political agenda that we've tried to be very frank about. Secretary Baker has presented it in considerable detail to Mr. Shevardnadze, and I had a chance to touch on it with President Gorbachev. And you see, it is hard for the American people to say, why put X billions of dollars of money into the Soviet economy when it's not reformed, when they're spending 18% of their gross national product on military, and when they're spending an estimated $5 billion in Cuba. We have some of our allies might not be as concerned about that last point as we are. I'm very concerned about it. So we want to try to be of assistance in reform. We can do a lot in terms of helping institutionally. The EBRD, in which we are a partner, a participant now, has in place some a facility for future lending. But I don't want to misrepresent this to our allies, nor to the Soviets. And that's why I say we've got difficulties with this that perhaps transcend the difficulties that others have.
You will not oppose the Allies giving direct aid, though?
Well, I want to talk to him about it, but I don't think we should tell Mr. Cole what his lending policy or finance policy should be. It's understandable. He's a neighbor. They've got quite different problems with the Soviet Union than we do. But normally it's best to have the alliance act in concert. And I expect we'll be talking about this not only at Houston, but perhaps at the summit at NATO.
Mr. President?
Yeah.
Do you believe that we reporters are being somewhat naive when we suggest in our stories that...
Yeah, because I didn't recognize you. I recognized him. I'll come back to it, Frank.
Okay, thank you.
Go ahead.
Oh, okay. A senior economic advisor in the last administration was fond of telling us that economic expansions don't die, bad policies kill them. Now that you're admitting that the economy is growing sluggish enough that tax revenue increases are needed, what policies went wrong? Why do we need this budget agreement so badly now?
In theory, I'm not sure I disagree with that. In practice, provided everything is kept in proper perspective in terms of the total GNP, revenue increase would not kill off economic growth. You've got to see what the size of it is, what form it takes, whether it's accompanied by incentives for growth, something I'm very much interested in. So you can't look at one piece of the package at this point as we're talking about solving a major deficit problem. And you also have to consider the total size of the deficit as it relates to our economy.
Well, sir, what I was asking is what went wrong? Why is it necessary now? Is this...
Yeah, I think we got slower economic growth than had been anticipated, and thus fewer revenues, thus a bigger deficit. We have a law requiring us to get the deficit down to certain levels. And so you got a combination, the discipline that the Graham-Rudman-Hollings causes and economic growth not being as robust as we predicted. And that is why we've got to do something right now. Frank, yeah?
Mr. President, in your research of what's happened to others, have you concluded that we're naive to suggest that the public takes campaign promises seriously?
No. I think people are smarter than a lot of us think they are, including me. And I think they're fair. And I go back to the experiences of previous people that have been in this office who say one thing in a campaign, come in and keep that pledge, if you're talking about taxes, for quite a while, and then see that there's an enormous problem facing the nation that requires a bipartisan answer. And if I had control of this Congress, both houses, we might not even be talking about this today. But there's a different feeling here, and I've got to see the country go forward. And I've got to take the heat that comes from certain quarters, political and other, and I'm prepared to do that because I think I'm on the right track, and I think in the final analysis, the American people will understand that.
You think the public understands this and takes this into account when they hear campaign playbook?
Well, I've seen polling figures that indicate that, but I don't want to suggest that all politicians are cynical. Certainly, when I was making comments of that nature, I was convinced that I could stay the course, and we did for a long time, and we may now. But let's see where we go in this negotiation, because more important than how people look at what I've said is what happens to the economy, what happens to jobs, what happens to economic growth. So when you make a change that people see as a dramatic shift, you got to batten down the hatches and take the heat. But I really am not trying to misrepresent my position. I feel comfortable about that because I've gone back and done a little research and seen these firestorms come and go. People who feel just as strongly on one side or another of an issue as I do and haven't gotten their way exactly. That's the American system, and I got to work with it. Congress can't. They can go out, everybody up there can go out and take a position, but it's only the president that has the responsibility for the whole executive branch approach. Yeah, a couple of more and then I'm going.
Mr. President, how do you explain to the country why you're treating this as essentially a Washington insider's game right now? Why not explain to the public what your list of priorities are within the spending and tax issues? Are there no longer any lines to be drawn in the sand based on your convictions on these areas?
Yeah, then they will be drawn in the negotiations, but then I'm going to do exactly what you're talking about. I'm going to tell the American people why this bipartisan agreement, which I'm still hopeful we'll get, is essential to the national interest. Carl?
The Republicans have gotten a lot of mileage in the last several elections out of what the Democrats think has been shameless demagoguery on the tax issue. By assuming that you get this bipartisan agreement, haven't you basically undercut that argument for your party? Hasn't your party now lost that issue?
Some will say so, but not if I go out and do my part and if I remind them of history. Take a look at the reaction in 1982, and it didn't have that kind of an adverse effect. Sarah, you thought I never...
Thank you. Here's a way, sir, I think you can solve your problem. Research shows you're going to NATO and you're going to try to reform it. Research shows that you can save $150 billion to $160 billion by cutting out the support that we give to other foreign countries by paying for their defense of Europe. Now, why in the name of God don't you cut down the spending that you're putting on NATO when we're really paying this for other countries that are going to a summit with you?
Because I believe that a strong NATO is in the national security interests of the United States. I think it is in our interest that Europe has kept the peace for 40-some years, that it is going more and more the democratic route, and we have a stake in it. Every taxpayer in the United States has a stake in world peace, and that's why I feel as I do about it. Last one.
Mr. President, going back to the S&L scandal, your son Neil has been involved in one of those failed S&Ls in Colorado, and I'm wondering if you've discussed this issue with him. Are you convinced that he is not guilty of any wrongdoing? And are you convinced also that a government that you had will be able to fairly investigate his role?
Yes, to your last question. And I have, what dad wouldn't, full confidence in the integrity and honor of my son. And I will stay out of anything to do with the investigation. But this is a fine young man. Everyone that knows him and saw him testify feels he's a fine young man, and but yet the system's got to go forward. And I'm convinced that if he has done something wrong, the system will so state. And if it hasn't, I hope it's fair enough to say, hey, the boy did nothing wrong.
Have you discussed this issue with him?
Only in that broad parental way, but making clear, and he would be the last to ask me in any way to get involved in any side or the other. I do think that those who allege misconduct ought to speak up and say what it is. But it's not been easy for him. He's probably the most sensitive of our four boys, maybe second most sensitive. I can't quantify this for you with all four of them. But he's a good kid, and it's not easy. He's held his head up. He, too, has taken a few shots on this. But he's had some good defenders from both sides of the aisle. And the system is going to work, whether it's the president's son or somebody else. And to suggest that it doesn't undermines the basic integrity of the American process, the American system. But it's not easy for him. But he'll do okay. Thanks. Last one, Sandy. Last one, then I got to go. Jesse, you don't get one today.
Okay. President, have you seen the Marion Barry tape, and what's your reaction to number 2?
I thought I'd get asked that, and I am simply not going to get into that matter. It is not appropriate. It is a matter for, in the courts, and please forgive me for not commenting on that one. Thank you all very much.
Yeah. President Bush more than 30 minutes today talking primarily about taxes and his decision, of course, that additional tax revenues are needed. He was quite defensive on this issue. He has been hearing a lot from his own party, especially from Republican congressional candidates standing for re-election this fall, and others who want to be elected to the Congress of the United States. Some of them met with him yesterday, and they were not at all happy with what is, in effect, a break of his campaign promise that there would be no new taxes. The president, of course, says that circumstances have now changed. The White House spin on all of this, their cover that they've arranged for themselves, is that we've got to have more jobs in an expanding economy, therefore taxes are necessary. Maureen Santini from the New York Daily News asked one of the really operative questions, however, and that is that 2 years ago all the signs were there that we would have this kind of a deficit, this kind of a sluggish economy. Why did the president make that promise at that time? He said he felt that he could stay the course, and they have until now. So that is the big issue in Washington, D.C. these days, and we'll have continuing coverage tonight, complete analysis of the president's position on taxes, also what happens when he goes to NATO next week, and that final question about his own son's involvement in a savings and loan that failed in Denver, Colorado. For now, I'm Tom Brokaw, NBC News, New York.
Or a make-or-break effort at responsible government. The congressional budgeting process must succeed, and the negotiators are facing tough questions about where to make cuts and where to raise the revenues. And these are not decisions that anyone relishes. They are decisions that Democrats and Republicans alike have got to face with candor and courage. And frankly, I believe that ultimately good politics is rooted in good government. And I'm optimistic that we can get a budget agreement legislated, which not only tells the world that America puts its fiscal house in order, but also will garner the full support of the American people. Secondly, this week we reached an agreement with the Japanese on structural impediments initiative that's going to help to open markets and create new opportunities for business and commerce. Next, we took an important step toward increasing jobs, opportunity, and economic prosperity throughout our own hemisphere. Enterprise for the Americas, an innovative and I think visionary plan for increased trade and investment with Latin America and the Caribbean, and the response from south of our border has been overwhelmingly positive. And this included a new proposal on official debt in the hemisphere, which will help our neighbors in Latin America and the Caribbean resume the process of growth. We developed a plan for protecting our coastal resources, this OCS decision, while also endeavoring to protect energy independence. And as I leave for the 4th of July holiday, then from there to the NATO summit, and then to the Houston Economic Summit, I just wanted to assure you that America will squarely face the challenges of leadership that are before us, both domestically and in terms of international affairs. Terry?
Mr. President, I'd like to ask you about your reversal on no new taxes. Do you consider that a betrayal of your promise? And what do you say to Republicans who complain that you've robbed them of the same campaign issue that helped get you elected?
Well, I think what I consider it is a necessary step to get stalled budget negotiations moving. And I am very encouraged with the approach taken now by Republicans and Democrats in this.
If you'd rather take the plunge.
Congress is about to close up shop for the 4th of July holidays, and so I thought it'd be a good idea to bring you up to date on a wide array of current topics and respond to your questions. During the next 2 weeks, the U.S. will join its allies in considering a number of crucial political, security, and international economic issues. And seldom in the last 40 years have such questions had such direct impact on the lives of all Americans. Today in the U.S., we are carefully examining the historic changes in Eastern Europe, size of our military forces, our ability to compete in world markets, the assistance that we provide to help emerging democracies, and the size and priorities of our own budget, and how to continue the 90 months of economic expansion that we've enjoyed. These issues are not abstract. Every American has a stake in how we as a nation address these very complex questions. On July 5th and 6th in London, the NATO alliance will gather to forge a new direction for the future. And at the Houston Economic Summit, we will press for progress in the Uruguay round of trade negotiations, discuss economic support for various countries, and review progress on the environment. These international concerns are reflected in many of the decisions I made just this week. First, we're doing what is necessary to assure continuation of the economic expansion, now in its 90th month, and we want to keep it going. We now estimate a deficit of over $150 billion in fiscal 1991, not counting the costs of the savings and loan cleanup. And this means that unless Congress acts, there will be a cutoff in October of nearly $100 billion in government services under the sequester provisions of the Graham-Rudman Hollings. The potential results, draconian cuts in defense, student grants, and a wide array of other necessary domestic services. And to avoid this, tough decisions must be made. And leadership is needed, and that is exactly what administration officials are seeking to provide, and indeed in these talks, I believe, are providing. The budget negotiations now underway. In these important discussions that are going on. I'm not going to discuss details, what I'll accept and what I won't accept, but things are moving, and I think that much more important today is getting this deficit down, continuing economic expansion and employment in this country. So that's the way I'd respond to it.
Well, what do you say to, can people trust politicians if they make statements and are willing to break them?
Well, you know, I recall a previous flurry when I was vice president, and there was some economic plans proposed back in '82 that caused a furor, something like we're hearing now. And the president, in my view, did what was right, and so I think that we're on the right track. And I think that the arrows have been flying, front, back, sideways, but that's what I get paid for. And I think we're on the right track now. And I think we'll have strong support from both sides of the aisle.
Mr. President, but do you believe it will hurt your credibility?
No, not in the long run.
Why not? A lot of people are already...
Because what people